is our first major event in the fall series, and we have a fall events card that's just come out that you can see if you didn't get it in the mail. Pick one up before you leave. There is one additional concert. What's the date for that, John?
I believe it's November 6th, but I'm not certain.
November 6th, but we will put that on our website as well. And that didn't make it onto the calendar, but we're having a chamber group as well. There's several concerts happening. Lots and lots of things happening here on campus. This evening, John Tilford will be speaking to you about the exhibition that he organized. He organized all the things that you see on view right now while I was working away at the gift shop. And everything, with the exception of 3 pieces which are on loan from private collections, everything had been given to us or came to us through assistance by our incredibly supportive membership. All of the objects in here, most of them are connected to current course offerings, which John does every semester, as many of you already know. But this evening he'll be focused on the Impressionist work from the Melamed family. Doctors Isaac and Yolanta Melamed have given us promised gifts over many, many years. Very high quality, beautiful pieces, many, many of them are French Impressionists. So John, my colleague, my friend, take it away.
Thank you, Elizabeth. As she said, almost everything in our permanent collection has been donated to the museum thanks to the patronage of individuals like you who are here this evening. Over the last 3 years, Elizabeth Peterson and I have tripled the size of the permanent collection without having spent a penny, which is quite remarkable when you think about it, because they've all been donated primarily from Atlanta-based families. And of all those families of patrons and donors, we can think of none greater than Isaac and Yolanta Melamed. They have made promised gifts to the university over the past 10 years, and Isaac has served as a university trustee for several years. And in the beginning of that relationship with the university, rather than making a pledge of cash, he made a pledge of gifts in kind, of works of art. And as a result, we have these incredible collections. So about a year ago, Elizabeth and I decided it would be only fitting that we focus primarily upon works from the Impressionist schools, which had been donated by Isaac and Yolanda over the past 10 years. And so here we see 2 of the key images from Auro Campagna. On the left, you see Eugene Montezan, and on the right, you see Paul Cézanne, the large bathers. And some of you may recognize both works from an exhibition we staged last year, When East Meets West. But all that to say that we pride ourselves at Oglethorpe on putting these gifts to work. We do not like to see them gathering dust in a storage vault. We like to see them in the classroom, so to speak, insofar as bringing the students into the museum and making the museum the classroom. So these are 2 key works from the exhibition that we opened most recently. But then, just before we were planning to open Auro Campagna, we received a call from Isaac, and he said, I want to give something special in honor of President Schall's tenure as president. And as many of you know, President Schall, unfortunately, sadly, will be stepping down as president later next year after 15 years of great service to Oglethorpe University. So Elizabeth and I went over to Isaac and Yolanda's home, and we were confronted by this magnificent work by Pierre Auguste Renoir entitled Maternity, dating to 1915, conceived in 1915, and cast with the assistance of Mayol. It is based on a composition 30 years earlier of Madame Renoir nursing their son Jean from 1885. This work is now in the Musée d'Orsay. So when we received the call that this work was coming, we were incredibly surprised and pleased and thrilled. And so we kept it as much of a secret as we could at Oglethorpe. We're a small campus, and word gets around. But we literally unveiled this work a few weeks ago when we opened the exhibition. But when I staged the exhibition, it's important, because we are an academic museum, to provide historical context for all the works. So one of the first works you see after the Renoir is this beautiful 18th century watercolor by Jacques-Philippe Quaresma entitled La Petite Thérèse, dating from 1783. And this is quintessential French Rococo. It's showing the French doing everything but govern, and it illustrates why there was a French Revolution forthcoming shortly after this work was painted. But it's a magnificent small-scale watercolor, it's about 8 by 6 inches. And when you see it in the exhibition, you're going to see a magnificent early original frame, which is most likely the frame used by the original owner in the 18th century. And if you were to look at the back, which you can't see in this image, you would see a series of very early labels and seals showing the provenance or the chain of ownership from day one, which is so important to our students to show how we evaluate works of art when coming into the collection. But again, the Renoir is the first thing you'll see in the exhibition because it is the most important work the Melameds have given us over the past 10 years. It is possibly one of only 3 known lifetime casts. It was created late in Renoir's life when his arthritis was so bad he had to have paintbrushes tied to his fingers to try and paint. And so when he turned to the subject of sculpting and he had the earlier painting in mind, he turned to an artist named Roberto Giano, who was the principal assistant to Aristotle Mayol, the great sculptor. And Giano assisted in creating the casts for these works, which resulted in the bronze that you see here today. So we're incredibly thrilled and humbled. The bronze was previously in the collection of Dr. Auerbach from Louisville, Kentucky. It was exhibited at the Speed Museum of Louisville about 5 years ago, and when Dr. Auerbach passed away earlier this year, it was offered at auction at Bonham's, and Isaac bought it and then immediately gave it to us. So we're very thrilled to have such a strong, close relationship with our patrons. But to get back to the issue of Impressionism, you have to remember that although the Impressionists, although they were originally known as the Independents, they were avant-garde, they were free-thinking, but they were still primarily men. It was a very masculine group of artists, and there were very few women who were permitted entry. We'll look at a few later. But this wonderful painting, entitled In Renoir's Home, at the Rue Saint-Georges in Montmartre, was painted in 1876. It's now in the collections of the Norton Simon Museum in California. And in the painting, on the back right, you see the elder Camille Pissarro, who was one of the eldest of all the Impressionists. And you have the great critic Georges Rivière in the center, who was also Renoir's biographer. But nowhere do you see artists like Berthe Morisot or Mary Cassatt. But as for Pissarro, again, one of the eldest of all the Impressionists, he was born in 1830 in St. Thomas. His father was Portuguese and of Jewish faith. The family had roots in France, and he was sent to Paris for schooling when he was 12. He returned to St. Thomas at 17. He was very precocious, and he was very rebellious. He wanted to do something so daring as be an artist, when his father thought he should go into the family business. And in 1852, after a series of arguments with his father, he fled to Venezuela and just declared once and for all that he would not follow the family's business. And by 1854, his parents gave in and allowed him to go to Paris and to study at the École des Beaux-Arts, and eventually at the Swiss Academy, and there he would meet Monet and Cézanne. During this time, he was heavily influenced by the work of Corot, and here this is one of 2 etchings that the Melameds have given us over the past 10 years, a souvenir of Rome, dating to 1866. It's a superb impression, and for those of you who love prints, it's a thickly inked impression as etchings go, and the paper is as white as the day it was printed. When you go into the exhibition and you see this work, you're going to see a second etching by Corot next to it. And it has not fared so well. It, unfortunately, has been exposed to light over the years, not here at Oglethorpe, but before it came to our collection. And so you can see the difference between a work that's been well cared for and one that has not been so well cared for. And again, that's a very strong, teachable moment here at a university museum. But also during this time in the 1860s, there were other free spirits and free-thinking individuals. And the greatest among them in France was Edvard Manet, who's seen here. And he reacted strongly against the establishment of the French Salon and the French Academy. And in 1863, this work, which we now know as an iconic example of 19th century French art, Le Déjeuner célèbre, Luncheon on the Grass, painted in 1863, it was rejected by the Salon. And Manet was incensed, and so he and his fellow free-thinking artist formed Le Salon de Refusés, the Salon of Refusals, and this work was exhibited as the centerpiece. And even the Emperor of France himself came to see this, because everyone wants to see what they're not supposed to see. And so this is now considered one of the great masterpieces of 19th century French art. In the last year of his life, he painted this magnificent composition entitled Bar de Fallée Bergère. Does anyone want to hazard a guess where it lives now? Maybe if you've seen it in your travels? It's in London. It was acquired in 1926 by a very wise Englishman named Samuel Courtauld. Samuel Courtauld was a great connoisseur of the day, and he was always buying against the trend. He was always buying better than most. And the family traced its origins to the 18th century, where they were gifted silversmiths. By the 19th century, the Courtauld family diversified into mourning clothing, because this is the time of Prince Albert's death, and Queen Victoria plunged the entire British Empire into mourning. And if you wanted to make money, you would make mourning clothing. And the Courtaulds made a lot of money. And so by the 1920s, Sam Courtauld and his wife had the resources to spend freely. And this is one of a number of works that he bought. The painting was not well received in Manet's lifetime. Manet died in his early 50s of syphilis, and this painting was in his studio at the time of his death. It changed hands a few times. By 26, Sam Courtauld got it. And it is now the centerpiece of the Courtauld Gallery. And as many of us know, the Courtauld Institute is the mother church of art history research and graduate studies in London. And this is, again, one of their great treasures. But this is the work of Edouard Manet. But it's important to realize that Manet never once identified himself as an Impressionist. He never wanted to be identified as an Impressionist. But he did spark the imagination in other artists that would go on to form the Impressionist movement. By 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out in France, and thousands of French citizens and expatriates who are living in France are forced to go into exile. And so here you have, again, an early self-portrait of Camille Pissarro, and you have a very striking portrait of the young Claude Monet by Charles Clermont-Durand. And on the right, you have a slightly later image of the great art dealer Durand-Ruel, painted by Renoir. But all three men fled France for London to seek safety, and they lived there for about a year and a half. And during that time, Durand-Ruel, the dealer, saw something in the work of Pissarro and Monet, and this is in 1870. By 1871, the latter part of the year, these individuals are able to come back to France. And the older Camille Pissarro, whose work is on the left, has strong influence on the work of Paul Cézanne, whose work is seen on the right. These paintings were painted about a year apart, 1871 and 1872, but it's literally the same spot on the same path in the same wood. And you have the master and the pupil, but not too far from one another. And so, a year and a half ago, when Isaac called President Shaw and said, let's have lunch at Waffle House, as they are often wont to do, after lunch, they also have this tradition of parking their cars next to one another, and out of Isaac's trunk, he pulled this magnificent Cézanne, because this is how Isaac likes to surprise us. And then Larry phones Elizabeth and myself, and we have a slight heart attack, and go over to the car and get it, and put it in safekeeping. But this is one of the very few lithographs that Paul Cézanne created in his magnificent career. It dates to the 1890s, 1896 to 1897 to be precise, and it's entitled The Large Bathers. You have to keep in mind that during this time and in subsequent years in the early 20th century, artists like Cézanne, Picasso, Matisse, and others began to realize, thanks to great dealers like Ambrose Vollard, that if you were an artist and you wanted to make money and you wanted to succeed, it was much easier to make one lithograph and print 100 copies and sell 100 copies for $100 than trying to sell one painting for $10,000. And so Cézanne was coaxed into this, but he really never cared for the medium of printmaking as much as others. But this is one of the great successes. And in the background you have the wonderful Mont Saint-Victoire. The painting is based on an earlier composition from the 1870s. And this is The Bathers. It's a very literal translation between painting and lithograph. But this is one of several works by Cezanne that were acquired by Albert Barnes of the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. And I should say that the Barnes collection once lived outside the city of Philadelphia. And over the years, some of you may know, that collection has battled numerous legal issues with trustees and foundations claiming ownership. And after several years of litigation, and much to the chagrin of artistic scholars, the Barnes collection was moved into the city of Philadelphia, which is the one thing Barnes never wanted. But that's just a side note. The happy point is that we have this wonderful image by Cezanne, which is strongly related to the work which now hangs here at Oglethorpe. When we exhibited the Cezanne lithograph last year for When East Meets West, 300 Years of Artistic Discourse, which showed the strong influence of Japanese art on European and American art, we hung it next to this magnificent 19th century Japanese work by Hokusai of Lake Misaka. And this wonderful work, wonderful impression, was loaned to us by the Gibbs Museum of Charleston, South Carolina. And I cannot say enough about the generosity of the Gibbs. They offered us carte blanche, one of the greatest collections of 19th century Japanese prints in America. And these were all owned by a single individual who once studied at Harvard and moved back to his native Charleston for reasons of his health. And they're now the Gibbs. So to put this work next to a Cezanne, which we know Cezanne was looking at Hokusai's work when he was creating the lithograph of the large bathers, it's beyond measure in terms of its importance. But you have to remember that in 1866, at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, this was the first time Europe was seeing large numbers of works of art from the East, especially Japan. And so Monet was absolutely enamored with earlier 19th century Japanese woodblock prints, as were almost all of the Impressionists. But this is a modern photograph of Monet's home at Giverny with dozens of Japanese woodblock prints. And here you see the great man himself in the late 19th, early 20th century. And the room really hasn't changed much in 100+ years. The only thing that has changed, there are these horrible people called curators. And they decided about 2 years ago that the original Japanese woodblock prints that had been hanging in this room for decades did not need to be on permanent view, that they were being damaged by light exposure. So when you go to Giverny today, you actually see photostatic copies of the originals. The originals are locked away. But that gives you a little bit of the historical foundations of Impressionism and the importance of Japanese art and culture on subsequent artistic movements in France and America. And here on the left, you see the original first exhibition of the artists who would become known as the Impressionists. They were originally known as the Society of Anonymous Artists, later the Independents, and eventually the Impressionists. This is the first exhibition catalog from 1874. It was staged here in Paris at the studio of Nadar. Nadar began as a 19th century political cartoonist and satirist, and in the mid-19th century, this new scientific creation called photography was brought to the forefront, and it put a lot of artists out of work, but Nadar decided to beat them at their own game and became a very talented artistic photographer. But he also wanted to help subsequent generations of artists, those who did not have certain advantages, and so he gave his studio space over to the Impressionists in 1874. And again, they were initially known as the Independents. And the art critics in the beginning, the first few exhibitions, and there were 8 in total, but in the first few exhibitions, the press was really quite cruel, and they would say things in press like, what are they independent of? People buying their art, their willingness to accept criticism. So it was really not a good show at first. But if only we could go back in time and buy something, like this, which is one of the first works exhibited by Camille Pissarro in the 1874 exhibition. It didn't sell. If we had that today, we could all retire to the south of France. But just to give you a little background on Nadar, who loaned his first studio, this is a wonderful lithograph by Honoré Daumier entitled Nadar Raising the Art of Photography to a Fine Art, in which he's literally on a hot air balloon over the city of Paris, photographing it to gain a bird's eye perspective. But it was because of artists like Nadar that artists like Pissarro could exhibit works like these in the first exhibition in 1874. By the time you get to the second exhibition, a few years later, the gallery space was offered up by Durand-Ruel, who we saw earlier was in exile with Monet and Pissarro in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. And again, we see this beautiful portrait painted by Renoir of Durand-Ruel. And here, Durand-Ruel, later in life, by the 1890s, his gamble had paid off. He literally bought over 5,000 works by the Impressionists. And for years, he couldn't sell a single piece. And the artist had it even worse. And so at one point, Claude Monet wrote to him from the countryside saying, I can't take this, I'm not making any money, no one loves my art, I'm going to burn these canvases from the expedition. And Durand-Ruel says, please God, don't do that, I'll send you a check, just send me the paintings. And so he supported these artists in every sense of the word for years. And when Claude Monet saw the house at Giverny and fell in love with it and wanted it, it was Durand-Ruel who provided the financing for the mortgage. Years later, by the 1890s, when the Americans came around and decided they did want to buy Impressionism, a number of these artists, and especially Durand-Ruel, became very wealthy men and women. But it took many years to get to that point. But Durand-Ruel didn't just collect, or didn't just sell the works of the Impressionists. He also truly loved the work. And this is his drawing room in Paris from the late 19th century. And you have this magnificent Pierre-Auguste Renoir. And here, a wonderful mother and child by Mary Cassatt. But they were a close-knit group of individuals. And this magnificent photograph, you see Mary Cassatt on the left and Madame Durand-Ruel. And the house they're standing in front of is the Chateau de Beaufresne, the house of beautiful ash, referring to the ash trees on the property. And this is a house which Mary Cassatt, again seen here, purchased in the 1880s when she decided she was staying in France once and for all. We'll get to Cassatt's life in a little bit, but this is just a wonderful photograph to show the relationship between dealers and artists at that time. And when Cassatt did buy this house in the 1880s, she did something so daring as to install modern conveniences like American plumbing. But getting back to the task at hand, and the wonderful gifts that have been given to us over several years by Isaac and Yolanta. This is one of the first gifts they made to us. It's a very small work. It's about 5 by 7 inches, pencil on paper, magnificent landscape by Camille Pissarro. It came up at Swan Auction House in New York about 10 years ago. Isaac bought it and immediately gave it to us. It was tucked away in our vaults, and it was shown for the first time last year during East Meets West. But it's a magnificent, sympathetic, atmospheric landscape by Pissarro. We like works on paper here at Oglethorpe University Museum of Art because works on paper show strong artistic intent, they easily show provenance and authenticity, and it's a wonderful teaching tool for our students. So Elizabeth and I always encourage our students to look first at works on paper when you're studying the work of an artist, and only then, once you master those compositions, should you look at the more complex works in oil. A later gift is this magnificent watercolor, also by Camille Pissarro, Prairie de Besancourt from 1890. And this one is about 6 by 8 inches. And this was such a magnificent work that when it came to the museum, our dear friends Michael and Lana Schlossberg, who are also great revered collectors of 19th century French drawings and sculpture, when they saw this, and they saw it in a very inappropriate modern frame, they decided that when they went to Paris a month later, they would scour the shops of Paris, and they found a beautiful late 19th century French Empire frame. So when you see this in the exhibition, you'll see this in a very appropriate frame. And so we're very lucky to have patrons that like to work with one another for the mutual benefit of this institution. A third work by Pissarro that the Melameds have given us over the years is this magnificent monotype. This is one of only a handful of monotypes ever created by Pissarro. A monotype is something between a print and a drawing. And the Impressionists love to experiment with this medium, especially Pissarro, Degas, and Cassatt. You would take a matrix, a plate, if you will, and you would ink the plate. And you would place a sheet of paper on top of the plate, run it through the press, pull back the sheet, and this is what you had. And then he took his finger and signed CP. And he would only do it one time, and that's why you call it a monotype. You can have various states of a monotype where you rework the plate slightly. But again, these are extraordinarily rare works of art. And this was especially useful, this particular work, last year in East Meets West, because we could hang it as a triptych next to this wonderful watercolor by Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith and an early 19th century woodblock print by Hiroshige. This is important because Alice Smith was from Charleston, South Carolina. She never left this country. Pizarro was in France. Both were looking at Hiroshige when they were creating their work. Because Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith, although she came from a very wealthy, old Charlestonian family, the money had long since run out. But she had her cousin's collection of Japanese woodblock prints, which are now at the Gibbs. So she literally taught herself Impressionism using Japanese woodblock prints as the base. She's a very smart woman. And again, this work is so Japanese, but if you saw the small installation we did last year to complement East Meets West, you saw some wonderful works by Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith. Unlike other artists of her day, she died a very successful woman. In the early 19th century, her work was gaining favor. A lot of wealthy northern tourists would winter in Charleston, and they would buy her work, but they wanted to buy the work she created of happy, bucolic, antebellum South. Everyone's happy, everyone's well-fed, no one's complaining, it was a total lie. And what she most wanted to paint were these native marshland landscapes that are quite poetic in their beauty. And this is what she painted for the Southern audiences. Toward the end of her life, toward the third quarter of the 20th century, gallerists like Knoedler's of New York were taking notice because New Yorkers were going down to Charleston to buy her work. And the galleries decided, why not bring her to New York? And so Knoedler's approached her and asked if they could represent her work. And she had endured years of financial struggle. So she finally caught a break. And they represented her work to great avail. She died very successful and very content. Her work has never gone out of favor. It's highly sought after. And in the last 5 years, it's even more sought after because you have a larger number of collectors who are acquiring Southern American female art because these things have not been given the attention they should have in the past, although Alice Smith is a slight exception. So her prices keep going up, and people have always loved her work. But this particular watercolor, which is about 6 by 8, this sold in Asheville, North Carolina last year for about $25,000. And we would love to have a piece by Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith here at Oglethorpe University, so please keep that in mind. But all that to say that she was a remarkable woman because she took secondary sources and made original, beautiful works of art, but all influenced both by Impressionism and by the Japanese. But again, getting back to the wonderful Melamed gifts, as I said, we like small works on paper. This is the Pizarro landscape we looked at earlier, and this is one of the sweetest little sketches you'll ever see by Pierre Bonnard. It's about 3 by 5 inches. It's on ruled graph paper, and it's never been shown before until last month. And so it's now hanging next to other works by Bonnard, but also works by Eugene Bourdin. And it's just a wonderful thing to have. And again, such a good teaching tool when you're dealing with connoisseurship and the history of art. And other small works of art, which have just come into the collection, albeit as a loan, is this wonderful little sketch by Mary Cassatt. It's pencil and watercolor. It's hanging straight ahead, third from the left, in that beautiful gilded frame. It is a loan from Alice and Peter Rogers, who were close friends of Michael and Lonnie Schlossberg. They acquired it in Paris a few years ago, and we'll get to the question of provenance in a bit, but it has a wonderful provenance. And again, it's just the sort of thing that we like to teach our students with. Cassatt was born in Allegheny City, Pennsylvania in 1844, which that is now part of Pennsylvania. She was born into an incredibly wealthy family, old New England stock. Her father, Robert Simpson Cassatt, was a very successful banker, stockbroker, and land speculator. He descended from French Huguenot ancestry, and the family originally came to this country in 1662 and settled in a city known as New Amsterdam. We now know it as New York. Her mother was Catherine Kelso Johnston, also came from a very old banking family. And unlike many women of her day, Cassatt's mother was extremely well-read and believed that all women should have access to strong levels of education. Her brother Alexander Cassatt would later become president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. And at a young age, the family moved east, eventually settling in Philadelphia, and she began her formal instruction at the age of 6. Like a lot of very wealthy families in America, they went on vacation to Europe, and they stayed for 5 years. They called it the Grand Tour. And so at a very young age, Cassatt learned firsthand in the great capitals of Europe, and really from an early age was determined to study art. But her father hated this idea. He saw no reason why his daughter, who was born into an extremely well-born family, wealthy family, why on earth would she want to do something so pedestrian as to become an artist? She had money, she could marry well, she could get more money, she could have a family, and she could live a life of leisure. But Mary Cassatt was absolutely hell-bent and determined to become an artist. And she proved even more stubborn than her father. So he begrudgingly allowed her to study at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts with artists like Akins when she was 15. When she was about 18, in 1866, she was then permitted to move to Paris with her mother as chaperone and study with some of the great masters, such as Gérôme. The only problem was the École des Beaux-Arts really didn't like foreigners, and they especially didn't like foreign women. And so Akins was able to talk himself into the École des Beaux-Arts. Cassatt and the other women in the group had to negotiate private terms with artists like Gérôme, pay them privately, pay them more than the male counterpart, and teach them after hours outside the formal confines of the academy. But it paid off, and her work was being accepted into the salons in Paris in the 1870s. By 1878, though, her style was becoming too daring, and this work, Girl in Armchair, from 1878, was submitted to the International Exposition World's Fair to hang in the American Art Pavilion. And the Academy organizers rejected it, and Cassatt was furious. And she was very close friends with an artist named Edgar Degas, and he encouraged her to exhibit with his fellow artists in the Impressionist exhibition of 1879. And we believe this painting was one of the first works she exhibited with the Impressionists. It's now in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. But she had a very close relationship with Edgar Degas. These two works were painted in 1880. We think, because Mary Cassatt never wore the same outfit twice, we think this was painted on the same day in the same room. The work on the left is a watercolor, a self-portrait by Mary Cassatt. The work on the right is an oil by Edgar Degas of Mary Cassatt. Two very different images. He's not terribly sympathetic with his friend. It's a very honest portrayal. And he shows her very much as an outsider, where she is much more sympathetic to herself. But nonetheless, they did have a very strong relationship. And a few years later, Degas painted this masterful pastel entitled At the Milner's, in which Cassatt is the model. This is important because this is one of dozens of pastels and oils and drawings that Luiza Havemeyer acquired for her own personal collection in America. Luiza Havemeyer was one of the wealthiest women in America in the late 19th and early 20th century. She was the daughter of an industrialist who died much too soon. And when she was of marriageable age, her mother decided the only man appropriate for her hand in marriage was Luiza's late father's business partner, so they could keep all the money together. But before Luiza married Mr. Havemeyer, she went to Europe like many well-born young American women, and she became close friends with Mary Cassatt. And they maintained a friendship throughout their lifetime. And they also maintained an advisor-advisee relationship throughout their lifetime, which Cassatt would establish with a number of other wealthy American women especially, but some men. And Cassatt would advise Luiza on what to buy. And the first time Luiza went to Paris, she had about $75 in pocket money for the week, which was a lot of money back then, but still not a huge sum. And Cassatt said, let's go to a gallery, I want you to meet my friend Edgar Degas. And they looked at a small pastel by Degas, and the price was exactly $75. And Louisine said, well, I have to have it. And she bought it, and decades later, that pastel sold for over $455,000. Cassatt was an extremely wise art advisor to her friend and to many friends. So what Mary Cassatt would do in the course of her life, especially when she was too busy to paint because she had to take care of sick relatives like her mother, because that's what women were expected to do back then, even if you were Mary Cassatt. And so she had to take a 5-year hiatus from painting. But again, Mary Cassatt being Mary Cassatt, had all these wealthy American friends who would come visit periodically in Paris. And she became an art advisor for 5 years. And she would work with these great families, and she would advise them what to buy. And she would especially advise them to buy Impressionist works by living artists, and she could get them directly from the artists themselves. So Havemeyer was the greatest of all these collectors. And after Cassatt had urged her to build up these great collections, she then urged Havemeyer and all the other friends, now you have this, you're very wealthy, you have a civic responsibility to society, I want you to bequeath all of your collections to major public museums around the country so that eventually the general public will have access to these great treasures. And they all did it, including Luiza Havemeyer. So this is now the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But getting back to Cassatt's work herself, this is a wonderful experimentation in color etching and aquatint from the late 19th century entitled The Coiffure. We borrowed this etching from the Georgia Museum of Art last year for East Meets West because it was such a strong example. It was one of 10 compositions that Cassatt published in the late 19th century. She printed 25 copies of each print, and then they were sold as a portfolio of 10 images. And they were divided between Durand Ruel's galleries in New York and Paris. The European market sold rather well. The American market did not sell well, and it infuriated Mary Cassatt. She thought her fellow Americans should be more supportive of her work. But this composition is heavily related to this work entitled Girl Adjusting Her Hair, which is now in the National Gallery of Art. It was once owned by Chester Dale, but it was first painted for her friend Edgar Degas as a gift. But we know when she created both the color print and the oil that she was looking at this work, this Japanese print by Nishikawa Tsukunobu from the early 18th century, and that it influenced both compositions. But when we exhibited this work last year in East Meets West, we hung it next to this magnificent early 19th century Japanese ukiyo woodblock print by Yoshi Toshi, Portrait of a Concubine, which is also a gift from Isaac and Yolanda Melamed. So again, great connections there. But at the end of Cassatt's life, she didn't rest on her laurels. She had a very strong sense of responsibility to people she cared about. And this is a wonderful portrait by Cassatt of Mathilde Vallée. And Mathilde Vallée was Cassatt's housekeeper and close friend. And at the end of Cassatt's life, in the 1920s, you see her here in 1924, 1 year before her death, she wanted to do something to look after Mathilde. And Cassatt thought that if she gave Mathilde a large number of her own works, those might appreciate in value more quickly than stocks or bonds, let alone cash. So she gathered 120 works on paper, prints, drawings, pastels, and she set them all aside for Mathilde. And when she died, they were given to Mathilde. And Mathilde sold the collection in 2 auctions in Paris over the course of several years. And each piece was stamped Collection Mathilde X, Mary Cassatt. So provenance is beyond question. And so last month, when that little beautiful Mary Cassatt showed up, we were thrilled because it has the Mathilde X provenance. So again, we can teach our students provenance is beyond question. And this is why this particular work is of such great value to Oglethorpe University Museum of Art, or for that matter, any academic museum. But getting back to Melamed gifts, which are plentiful, this beautiful work on the right, it's about 4 inches by 6 inches, tiny little thing, pastel by Eugene Boudin, Boudin was also one of the elders of Impressionism. He literally taught Claude Monet how to paint with oil. And this is a work that was given to us by Isaac and Yolanta about 4 to 5 years ago. It holds its original frame. It's held in its original frame, rather, I should add. And on the back, you see the original exhibition labels written and signed by Eugene Boudin. So it's a magnificent treasure. And another reason this work is so important is because when we were staging East Meets West, we were hoping to include the work of Winslow Homer. And this, I do apologize for the quality of this photograph, but this is a wonderful, small, again, 4 by 6 inch watercolor by Winslow Homer from 1878 from the Houghton Farm series. And it lives in a private collection here in Atlanta. So we asked the donor, who wished to remain anonymous, if they would consider lending it to us so that we could hang the Boudin next to Winslow Homer. And they immediately said yes. We were very happy. Sadly, it went back to the owner. It's not here at Oglethorpe anymore, but we were very glad to have it for the semester so that we could use it as an instrument of education. And Professor Hirschler, who's here this evening, his students actually researched both of these works as part of a course that he taught in relation to that exhibition. The work on the right is also from the Houghton Farm series by Winslow Homer, a bit more color, about the same size. It is now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. It was bought by Paul and Rachel Mellon. Paul Mellon was the son of Andrew Mellon, the founder of the National Gallery. Paul Mellon and his wife Rachel, known as Bunny, were voracious collectors, and at the death of Mr. and Mrs. Mellon, hundreds of works of art were then given over to the National Gallery following that family's tradition. But all that to say that both works are quite seminal because they were painted again in 1878 at Houghton Farms, which was owned by Mr. Valentine, who was a great patron to Homer. And when these were first exhibited in galleries in New York in the late 1878-79, the critics had mixed reviews. Some liked them, others found them too stenographic, they were too sketchy. But of course today we consider them great treasures. But the press was very quick to pick up on the focus of sheep. He's painting images of shepherdesses and their flocks in New York, and this is 1878. The Civil War is still a very fresh memory in people's minds. And everyone in New England loves that Homer is focusing on northern wool and not southern cotton. Also around this time, Homer goes back to the American South. Although he is a New Englander, he did spend time with Harper's, traveling with the Union Army, depicting the activities of the Union Army during the Civil War. But in the 1880s, he comes back and he creates this magnificent composition entitled Cotton Pickers. And it really upset a lot of Southern critics and Southern gentry when it was painted in 1876, because they didn't think Homer should be painting poor African-American migrant workers. He should be painting beautiful Southern beauties, like Thomas Sully had been doing in 1823, the Egerton sisters. Now, I should say, in point of correction, these ladies are actually from the North, but they're very symptomatic of what Sully would have been painting in terms of Southern subject matter. Beautiful antebellum grace, not migrant workers. However, today, this is considered a far greater composition than the Sully, and they both live at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Another great gift that Isaac and Yolanta gave us about 7 to 8 years ago, prior to my arrival here at Oglethorpe, is this magnificent large-scale pastel by Maximilian Luce, who began his career as first an Impressionist, and then he moved toward Pointillism, and later as a neo-impressionist. And this is an unusually large work by Luce. We know that it was sold by the artist in his lifetime because there is no estate stamp, as we'll see in another case. But what's equally important about this work is that it inspired one of our students who graduated last year, Bradley Austin Franco, who has been collecting since he was 12 years old. And last year he bought this beautiful little sketch in Paris by Maximilian Luce because he had admired this work during his days as a student at Oglethorpe. And this work is about 12 by 18. This is about 6 by 8, quite small. But again, you have this beautiful loose stamp. This is not a collector's mark, this is an estate stamp. So when an artist would die, the executors would seal the studio. The stamp would be created, and every piece in the studio by the artist would be stamped to prove that it was an authentic work by the artist in question. So again, that's great provenance. Other recent gifts include this magnificent work on the left by Pierre-Eugène Montezan, who was born in 1874, lived until 1946. It's entitled Woman Laying Out the Wash. You can just make her out right here. But it's painted in a much earlier Impressionistic style, even though it dates to 1941. It's very similar to what Pissarro was painting in the 1870s, because he's constantly looking back. And Montezan was one of the greatest landscape painters in 19th, 20th century France. And during this time, landscape painting was considered secondary or tertiary to other forms of painting. History painting and portraiture were the great mediums that most artists would aspire to. But Montezan persevered, and he was the first landscape artist in 40 years to win the gold medal in painting by the Salon in Paris. So he really elevated his work. Montezan is an artist whose work has not been given a great deal of attention in the past, but we're now giving him much more attention. This work was offered at Christie's in London last year. Isaac bought it for about $45,000 and then gave it to us. And it's going to be published in the upcoming Catalogue Raisonné. So again, it's quite a bargain compared to what you would pay for at Pissarro of the same caliber. So again, we're just so fortunate to have this strong relationship with patrons like Isaac and Yolanta, and they're giving us these things because we do put them to work, and they do benefit our students as instruments of education. And we're all the better for that, because that's the whole point of an institution like OUMA. Moving past Impressionism, as I said, I began the exhibition with pre-Impressionism, and we ended it with post-Impressionism. This is a masterful lithograph by Henri Matisse, dating to 1922, Le Repose du Modèle. It's important because it's the best of two editions. There were two editions of this lithograph. One was only signed in the plate. The deluxe edition, was signed with a wet signature in the margin as well. So there are only a handful of these. There are many more of those with just the plate signature. And it's a superb impression that Isaac gave us about 9 years ago. And we also love it because it foreshadows movements of later artists, slightly later artists. Raoul Dufy, who's about 8 years younger than Matisse. But Matisse would exhibit at the first Fauvist exhibition in 1905. Dufy would follow a few years later and take the movement even further. But I hope, as we've looked through a number of these works, that you begin to see something of the breadth and depth of great artistic, cultural philanthropy, and that without patrons like Isaac and Yolanta, our jobs would be far, far more difficult, and our students' education would be far more lacking. Thank you.
And it's got to be a lot of fun, too.
It's a lot of fun. I will be glad to try and answer any questions you might have. Yes, Jay.
Could you talk a little bit about, at several points you mentioned the value of the painting and how it changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Could you just speak to that a little bit about how it's developed over time?
Absolutely. So a good case study would be this Eugene Montezan. Isaac bought this at Christie's, South Kensington. For those of you who know a little bit about the auction markets, Christie's in London is based at King Street, but for many, many years they had a smaller house in South Kensington where they would sell things of lesser value but in larger volumes. And sadly, because the world has become far too greedy, Christie's and Sotheby's have closed down their little houses, and they only keep the big houses in King Street and New Bond Street. But Isaac bought this at Christie's, South Kensington about 2 years before he gave it to us, I think. Do you remember, Elizabeth? because I know it came to us around 2014. Isaac bought it, I think, 2 years before. He paid about 25,000 US dollars. It's now worth at least 50. That's a good return on investment. Not that we view works of art as investment, because we're museums, we're above things like money. But it has appreciated. And the point I'm really trying to make is that Isaac and Yolanda are very wise connoisseurs, and they buy well. And they almost always buy at auction, where you're buying things at a wholesale rate as opposed to buying from a dealer at a retail rate, which is often 2 to 10 times higher than what you pay at auction. But that requires a great deal of knowledge and confidence to go into an auction house and bid against dealers. Yes?
Say something about, since this, using this exhibition of wonderful works as a teaching instrument, sort of how you go about the broad ideas behind how you curate it, how you compose it, what the main themes are that you want to be illustrated through the work as a teaching tool. They come up in your talk, but as we look at the whole collection, what should strike us in terms of themes and things to learn from it?
Whenever I'm trying to stage an exhibition like Auro Campagna, which is a very specific thesis, I always like to form things around a narrative and to tell the narrative through the works of art, and usually to work those things out in a chronological fashion as much as possible. I also did that when we did When East Meets West, which is almost purely chronological. Not always, but often it's the narrative. As opposed to this room, which Elizabeth mentioned, we stage every semester with 30 to 40 works of art that are aligned to current course offerings. That's a different scenario because I have to address as many different subject matters as possible. So I really can't tell as strong a narrative, but there's much more diversity in this room than in the other gallery. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
Will the Renoir sculpture be on permanent view?
Well, you know that word, permanent view. We are a smaller museum, a boutique museum, I think is the word we like to use now. We hope to have it on view as much as possible. And another reason we want to have it on view as much as possible, not just because it's a Renoir, it's a bronze. And unlike a lot of our collection, which is work on paper, like what you see on this wall, it's not degraded by exposure to light. So it can stay out as long as possible. But it needs to stay within the confines of this museum for reasons of security and conservation, so we can keep the climate correct and keep the security strong. But we hope to keep it on view a very long time. Another example of that, if you look far left wall behind you, that wonderful strong image, La Pietà by Chenique Gay, of the mother holding her dead son, which is influenced by Michelangelo's Pietà from the late 15th century. That was acquired as part of an initiative led by our students last year, when it was realized that we had not one single piece of art in the collection by an African American artist. And the students quickly raised a large sum of money, and they asked Elizabeth and I to give them counsel and advice on certain artists to consider. They tried to buy 2 separate works at auction, but were outbid. And then they came across the work of Chenique Gay and acquired this work. And we're only the 3rd museum in the country to have work by her. She just graduated from Georgia State. She's already in the collections of Mrs. Obama and Samuel L. Jackson. So we're really lucky we got that work when we did. All that to say that that's another work we want to keep on view as much as possible. I'm also pleased to say that shortly after the Chenique Gay was acquired, Elizabeth and I received this unexpected package, which happens sometimes, we get surprises. And the work directly behind you all on the left is the first work by Romare Bearden in her collection, one of the great African-American artists of the 20th century. So while we acknowledge our shortcomings, we are working to correct them. Anyone else? Yes.
Some time ago, there was an African-American woman who was doing quilting pieces.
Phyllis Stevens.
Do we have any, does the university have any of those?
No. Elizabeth did organize a beautiful exhibition of her work from local
It was
private
beautiful.
collections. One problem with work like that, it's very large, and it is extremely fugitive, extremely sensitive to light. It's very light fugitive, and it can't be shown for large periods of time. But it was a wonderful show.
It was all drawn from private collections.
It was very special.
Mhm. Yes.
I had a question, but there's a really delightful book out if anybody's interested in learning more about Mary Cassatt and Degas. It's called I Always Loved You. Written by Robin Oliveira, filled with historical facts about art, but I'm just getting into where he invited her to the salon now. But I think it's going to be a really good read.
They had a really great relationship. I mean, there was rivalry in the 1890s. Cassatt was invited to create a large mural for the Columbia Exposition World's Fair in Chicago. It's a modern woman. And it was a huge, beautiful composition. Unfortunately, because it's the World's Fair, everything was considered temporary and it's destroyed. And they did away with it after it was gone. But at first she thought she didn't want to take that commission because it was the World's Fair, not too lowbrow. And then she found out Degas was furious that she was asked, and so she accepted it. Yes, Jay. Oh.
I was just going to add, I teach a film course on the French New Wave, and you have the same issue there, exclusively male directors, with the exception of Anya Stockdale, who we just lost last spring. It took a long time for her to be recognized as the only female director in this group. It's just very similar. It just strikes me as very.
And you know, I think female artists are beginning to come to the forefront in terms of earlier female artists. We did a major retrospective 2 years ago on Hattie Salsey of Savannah, and we now have the second largest collection of work by that artist in the country. But I think that female artists are beginning to get more of the credit and recognition that they deserve. Yes, Liz.
I love learning more about Cassatt's relationship with Duran Noel's family and how she studied, which I never really learned about. What do you know about Brett Morisot and where did she study? Do you know a bit about her?
So Brett Morisot, like Cassatt, was born into a very wealthy family, albeit French, old French aristocratic family. I do not know for certain that she studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, but I'm guessing because she was a wealthy French lady that she would broker private tutorials with artists like Jérôme and others. But I can't offhand think of the specific artist that studied or that she studied under. But since you mentioned that topic, it's very important to remember, this is something a lot of people never talk about. The Impressionists, as we know them today, as that group, were a large group of very poor men. Morisot and Cassatt, the only women, but there were a few other women that exhibited occasionally, but the only two principal female Impressionists were Morisot and Cassatt, were also the wealthiest of the group. And oftentimes when those exhibitions had to be organized and there had to be money put down for renting gallery space and men didn't have it or wouldn't pay it, it was Cassatt and Morisot who would fund these exhibitions. And when Cassatt would advise her wealthy American friends what to buy, she would send them to her fellow male Impressionist artists. So it's really the women who financed what we now know as Impressionism. Well, thank you all very much. I think we'll keep the galleries open a bit longer if you'd like to see the works we looked at. They never talk about that bit.